Hey everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the Catholic philosopher René Girard, and he's been increasingly influential lately. For example, our new Vice President Vance has cited him as an influence on his thought. And today I'm talking to my friend Trevor Cribben Merrill, who produced the very interesting new documentary Things Hidden, The Life and Legacy of René Girard, which you can watch now for free on YouTube. Trevor is a novelist, literary critic, and Gerard scholar based in LA. He has a PhD in French literature from UCLA. His nonfiction writing has appeared in Compact, First Things, and Genealogies of Modernity, among other places, and he previously appeared on this podcast to discuss his very enjoyable first novel, Minor Indignities. And I'm happy to have Trevor back on the show so he can convince me why I should read René Girard. Welcome back, Treasure. I just called you Treasure. Whoa. Okay, let me say that again. I misspeak a lot. Freudian slip.
I will answer to the name Treasure.
Okay, I'm going to keep that in. Actually, welcome back, Treasure.
Well, thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here and to be talking with you again. And I hope that I can meet the challenge that you have just set me.
Well, so I will say after watching the documentary, I'm more interested in reading Gerard than I ever have been in the past. So it was successful and very interesting in general, very well produced. Well, where to start? Okay, well, let me just ask about your background with Gerard then.
Sure. And, I should maybe mention up front very quickly, and maybe we'll get to this later, that the documentary is directed, it was shot and edited by Sam Sorich.
Yes.
And he and I produced the film together, and I collaborated very closely with him. But I think it's worth mentioning his name since he was the driving force behind it.
Absolutely.
And it was wonderful to work with him.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of meeting him at the Notre Dame Fall Conference last year.
That's right. Yeah, he was there with a handful of Catholic filmmakers and cinephiles
right.
whom we both know. So I came to Gerard. It's interesting. I did an undergraduate degree in literature at Yale, and the degree in literature really could have been called a degree in literary theory. So we read many of the French theorists who were then very much still in vogue, above all Derrida, but also Foucault. I recall taking a seminar on Foucault and Nietzsche, Althusser, Baudrillard, who I think is actually, who has sort of endured as a thinker whose ideas still have some very good relevance today, and many others. And I never once did I hear the name René Girard in my time there. Although Gerard was very much a member of this cohort and was close friends with Derrida for a time, whom he invited to the United States for the first time, and he had a dialogue with Foucault and others. It wasn't until I left college and moved to France the year after college to teach English there in a French high school that I stumbled upon a footnote in a book of essays by Milan Kundera. The book of essays is called Testaments Betrayed. It's a very beautiful book, and much of it is about music. But there is a footnote in that essay in which Kundera, who at the time was my favorite novelist, says René Girard's book, Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, which is translated in English as Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. René Girard's book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, is the best book I've ever read on the art of the novel. So I was inspired by that footnote to go directly to the bookstore and seek this book out. And quite frankly, I assumed, because I'd never heard of it before, that it was an obscure work and that it might be difficult for me to find it. But the bookstore that I went to had a copy. I started to read it, and I was immediately, very interested in what this book was telling me.
Great. And so, what kind of impact did it have on you?
Well, I think the first impact it had is that it gave me a way of articulating explicitly, putting a label to things that I had experienced, in particular in my undergraduate days. I was not Catholic yet. I was involved, as young people are, in chasing after girls and so forth. And I realized that I had experienced the phenomenon that René Girard described as mimetic desire or triangular desire. In other words, that my attraction to certain people had ebbed and flowed according to the laws of desire that Girard was spelling out and that he had derived from the works of the great European novelists. So that was one thing. I was persuaded that Girard was onto something, that he had my number. And then I think the second thing is that I really wanted to be a novelist. And Girard seemed to offer a blueprint for the novel that was very authoritative and seemed to be getting under the skin of these writers in the way that novelists themselves were thinking about what novels do. And his idea that the conflict that's necessary to good storytelling comes from mimetic desire and its effects was, quite interesting to me. I thought, well, maybe this will be helpful to me in my work as a writer, my attempts to become a writer. And then finally, it was this idea of the novelistic conversion, the idea that the greatest novels are always the fruit of some kind of conversion experience in the life of the author, which may be explicitly a turn to Christianity and Catholicism, but may also just be sort of structurally congruent with religious conversion, as in, say, Proust or Flaubert. This idea that a conversion experience was at the origin at the foundation of great novels made me take the idea of conversion very seriously, frankly, because I wanted to write a great novel. And I thought, well,
Wow.
if in order to write a great novel, I have to be converted, maybe it's time for me to seek out conversion.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And one thing that does kind of it makes Gerard sound very appealing, actually, the way you just described it, because there's something mentioned in the documentary that he applied his own theories to himself, that it wasn't just a historical or a literary analysis, that these things were actually applicable to the real life and to the spiritual life, and that he wasn't just doing it, abstractly and academically, and that makes him a compelling figure to me.
Yeah, it made him a compelling figure to me too when I finally met him around 2005, and then was able to work with him pretty closely because I started to work closely with his editor and later his biographer, Benoit Chantre, who's a French intellectual and essayist and editor. And when I finally met Gerard, what impressed me, first of all, and I think it has impressed many others who met him, was just how clear it was that he was a completely unpretentious man with a great sense of humor and very little self-seriousness. And so you thought, okay, well, what he's saying about renouncing vanity and envy and jealousy and all these things, he's not just paying lip service to these things. This is clearly something that he has undergone in his own life because the evidence is right there in front of you. And I do think that the story of his conversion is fascinating. He was trained as a medieval historian. He came to the U.S. after the war in 1947, and we tell this story a little bit very quickly in the documentary. And just because he was French and could speak French and sort of ostensibly had some cultural knowledge of France and French literature, he was asked to teach French literature. But the truth was that he didn't really know any of these classic novels that well, and he hadn't even read some of them. And so he was asking himself, like, what am I going to do? What am I going to say to these kids? And so he searched through the novels for something to say, and he stumbled upon this pattern, which is that he realized that the heroes of a lot of these novels by, say, Stendhal, The Red and the Black, this novel about Julien Sorel, a very ambitious young provincial Frenchman in the 1820s, who wants to be like Napoleon. This guy, he wants to be like Napoleon, and that sort of influences everything that he does and sort of gives him a specific worldview where all of his desires and all of his perceptions are filtered through this Napoleonic ideal. So that he found a similar pattern in Don Quixote, which was a book that he loved since he was a child. And I think the pattern is quite clear there. Don Quixote wants to be this awesome knight who can go out and defeat anybody, cut giants in half and rescue fair maidens and so on. But the reason he wants to do that is because he's been reading about these amazing knights in these romances of chivalry. And so again, his whole worldview is filtered through this model or this hero, and so on and so forth, in other European novels. So he finds this pattern, and then as he's exploring the conclusions of these novels, where many of the characters have these deathbed experiences where they renounce their mad quests to become an awesome knight or to become Napoleon or what have you, he was asking himself, like, should we take these conclusions seriously? Like when when Don Quixote sort of wakes up from his madness and says, "Well, by God's grace, I'm no longer deluded. I don't have this impossible dream anymore, and now I hate these books of chivalry that were sort of ruling my life." Is that just sort of a rhetorical device that's tacked on to the ends of these novels to make them acceptable to the ambient culture, or is there something deeper going on? And I think it was probably while he was reflecting on Proust and Dostoevsky in particular that he started to think and really believe that what was going on in these endings was really existential, that somehow the novelist was owning up via these characters in his own life to these obsessions that had been ruling his life and that were unhealthy and that were leading him into all of these impasses and dead ends. And that by writing the death of the character, the novelist was somehow exercising his own demons. And then it started to happen to him, to Girard himself, as he was reflecting on this.
Well, so does he think of mimetic desire as something like fundamentally pathological, or is it kind of an Aristotelian observation, like all men by nature desire to know, and that can go in bad directions? Or is it just something we just need to recognize about ourselves and channel it in the right direction?
I think this is a crucial question. I actually think there are maybe two or three questions in what you've just said that it would be great to unpack.
Okay.
I think that if you read his early books, you could get the impression, and it's maybe not entirely a false impression, that he does see mimetic desire as somehow bad, sort of like there's it's just something that we need to get out of. And so basically, because the world is sort of ruled by mimetic desire, we somehow just have to like renounce the world and get out of the world and maybe go into a cloister or something, like several of the novelistic characters end up doing. Notably, in Stendhal's great novel, The Charterhouse of Parma, that's what happens at the end of the novel. Mm-hmm. The hero literally withdraws to a monastery, to a charter house. I think, though, even in that first book, Deceit, Desire, in the novel, and then more and more in his later books, Girard would be an Aristotelian. He would define the human as an imitative creature and say that man distinguishes himself from other animals inasmuch as he is more mimetic, more imitative than they are. So the foundation of the human for him it's not bad. I think he saw mimetic desire as somehow consonant with the doctrine of original sin. And that's something that, has to be teased out too. It's something he wrote about, but I think there's a lot of work left to be done to sort out some of these questions.
Well, it seems like part of it functions as a counter to kind of the modern idea of authenticity, that all of our desires have to come from sort of solely, primarily from this place deep within ourselves.
Yes.
Which is not something that Gerard is denying, but it's like he's saying that, I mean, this is all secondhand for me, but it sounds like what he's saying is that this is just how human desire works, ultimately, that it's not all original.
Yes. I mean, he even in one of his later books, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, he even just starts with the Ten Commandments. He says, well, in my earlier books, I derived all of these ideas from the European novelists, and that was legitimate and an interesting method. But really, if I had known about the Ten Commandments, I would have started there, because with the 10th commandment, you have this interdiction against coveting your neighbor's stuff. Mm-hmm. And Girard says we shouldn't really think about that verb covet as a kind of unusually sort of acquisitive and sinister desire. It just means desire. Like we should not desire our neighbor's oxen, our neighbor's house, our neighbor's wife. And why the emphasis on the neighbor? Well, it's probably just because the neighbor is the proximus, the one who's proximate to us, and the one whose desires we're most likely to imitate. And so he sees the Ten Commandments, or the 10th commandment, as this interdiction against mimetic desire. And it's sort of like the first commandment and the 10th commandment are in counterposition. You sort of like, if you love God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and so forth, you're not going to be looking to the neighbor in an envious way.
Right.
Yeah.
But it seems that mimetic desire is something more than just envy.
Yes.
Because otherwise there would be nothing particularly new about that idea.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I love this question. And man, there was Sam came up with this really great little bit about Shakespeare and Gerard that we couldn't put into the film. And I hope there'll be some way to release it as like a deleted scene down the road, because Gerard organized this big conference in 1966 at Johns Hopkins University. And by the way, I'm getting to the envy thing.
Sure.
But he organized this big conference in 66. And it was supposed to be a celebration of structuralism. And so he invites Levi-Strauss to be like the big keynote speaker. But Levi-Strauss backs out at the last minute. And so he's kind of scrambling to find a replacement. And he calls a friend who is a high school teacher in France at an elite high school. And high school teachers in France have this like influence and intellectual credibility that they don't in the United States. And so this guy was really plugged into the French intellectual scene. And he said, well, I know this young man, nobody's heard of him yet, but he's about to publish these brilliant essays. His name is Jacques Derrida. So why don't you invite him? And so he invites Derrida to Johns Hopkins. And Lacan is there too. And Lacan is like this like genius clown who's just like dominating everybody with his antics and frustrating them too, because he's trying to talk in English even though he doesn't speak English. And but he's sort of like running circles around everybody. And then Derrida delivers this paper, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, which is one of his best essays and a very, very famous one, which I had to read when I was an undergraduate. And Derrida is capable of going head to head with Lacan in a way that nobody else at the conference is. I mean, this is like assembling all the luminaries of French thought at the time. And so Derrida immediately, he's in front of this audience of American academics, and he makes this huge impression. And within a couple of years, everybody at Johns Hopkins is a Derridian. And so Gerard said, like, this was disgusting to me. And so I left for the University of Buffalo. And at the University of Buffalo, like the French department was super traditional, apparently, and really didn't like Gerard that much. And so he gets involved with the English department. And that's when he discovers Shakespeare. And he thought that Shakespeare had sort of understood everything that Gerard himself understood about mimetic desire, and that he had sort of explicitly and in an intellectual way engaged with these mimetic patterns in his theater. And so finally, after teaching course upon course on Shakespeare, in 1990, Gerard publishes this book called A Theater of Envy, William Shakespeare. And so, so I just wanted, if I can, I don't know, can I just read like a passage from this?
Sure.
Yeah, so this is the introduction to A Theater of Envy. Shakespeare can be as explicit as some of us are about mimetic desire and has his own vocabulary for it, close enough to ours for immediate recognition. He says, suggested desire, suggestion, jealous desire, emulous desire, and so forth. But the essential word is envy, alone or in such combinations as envious desire or envious emulation. Like mimetic desire, envy subordinates a desired something to the someone who enjoys a privileged relationship with it. Envy covets the superior being that neither the someone nor something alone, but the conjunction of the two, seems to possess. Envy involuntarily testifies to a lack of being that puts the envious to shame, especially since the enthronement of metaphysical pride during the Renaissance. That is why envy is the hardest sin to acknowledge. So he will go on to say that while all envious desires are mimetic, not all mimetic desires are envy.
Okay.
But I think it's important to start there. Like what he sees is like, yes, fundamentally, mimetic desire is envy. And maybe the reason he says in this introduction that his theory caught on was that it was a way of talking about envy that was sort of a little bit easier for people to take. Like if you talk about envy, it's like, oh, this is like this religious word. It's sort of unfashionable. It sounds kind of archaic. But if you say mimetic desire, that's cool and trendy and up to date. It's sort of like a piece of jargon. And so, like, he suggests like maybe this misunderstanding helps my previous books to succeed. So I'm going to title this one with this more abrasive word, envy, a theater of envy.
Okay, so well, that leads me to another point. You know, part of the reason that I have thus far been a little bit like resistant to the Gerard thing is that, you know, he has these like two big ideas that are very kind of sexy sounding, like mimetic desire and scapegoating, and the sometimes it seems like people talk about them as though they're like this new master theory of everything, and he's finally like unlocked the secret of like Judeo Christianity, and you know, and I think I hear people in casually invoking mimetic desire more often than I hear people casually invoking scapegoating. But you know, what do you make of that? I mean, what? It's kind of an open question, but should it not be treated as this sort of theory of everything, or if it is, you know, what do we do with that? Is it overhyped, or is it just how do you integrate it with kind of Christianity rather than like having it be like dominating your worldview?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. It's an open question for me. On a 30,000-foot level, I would say yes, there's the risk that this theory can become like a second gospel, and I think it needs to be integrated into the Catholic intellectual tradition. I think that's its natural home, and I hope it's its future home. I should say that you know, René Girard was from the time of his reversion in his late 30s, at which point he had his kids baptized and he convalidated his marriage. He was just a Catholic, you know, for the rest of his life. And he attended St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in Stanford, and it's always been fascinating to me that there is this, is the Dominicans ran the parish, I think, and there's this big stained glass window of St. Thomas, where you at the front of the church, just where you expect it to be. And so Gerard would have been like in this, staring contest with Aquinas, for like decades of his life. And I always wonder sort of what went through his mind. I would say so. Of the two terms that you mentioned, mimetic desire and scapegoating, I think mimetic desire, is arguably a technical word, arguably even a kind of jargon. Scapegoating is a colloquial word that I think Gerard simply wanted to make the case that the colloquial use of the word scapegoating is actually represents a tremendous epistemological achievement that we owe to the Bible and to the Gospels. And then with regard to mimetic desire, you wonder sort of how many of sort of the coils of the serpent you really need to be familiar with in order to, sort of have a flourishing and virtuous life. Like, I do think that mimetic desire captures something that, say, Thomas's discussion of envy doesn't quite capture. I mean, one example of this would be that in the Summa, St. Thomas points out that you can only envy someone who is close to you. You wouldn't envy someone who is far away from you or whose achievements are sort of impossible for you to equal. So it's like envies like. And this aligns really well with Girard's understanding of what he calls internal mediation, which is the modality that mimetic desire takes in the modern democratic world, where hierarchies have collapsed and people's spheres of possibilities overlap, and any of us can sort of imagine ourselves into the shoes of anybody else and
Right,
ask
because I was
ourselves.
about to say, people do envy celebrities and rich people and Bill Gates and whatever else.
Yes, that's right. They do, but I think I think like Girard's insight into mimetic desire in the modern world is sort of consonant with Aquinas on envy. Like we sort of uh, as the Purdue comparatist Sandy Goodhart says at the beginning of the documentary, he first heard René Girard, and the line that he remembers from the lecture that made a big impression on him as a grad student was, human beings uh, don't fight because they are different, they fight because they are the same. So it's that likeness that sort of intensifies desire and makes conflict more likely.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, envy and mimetic desire overlapping. But then there's also this thing, this external mediation, is Girard's technical term for it in his first book, which is a sort of unidirectional imitation, where you imitate somebody who's far above you or very distant in a peaceful way, in a positive way, an aspirational way.
Right.
And sort of that is mimetic desire, or it's at least imitative desire, but it is not envy.
Okay. Interesting.
And then you could say that, like, there are these very protean sort of possibilities for mimetic desire that novelists and playwrights tend to explore in their works. An example of this would be, say, the play As You Like It, Shakespeare's As You Like It. There's this shepherd who's chasing after a shepherdess. Mm-hmm. And like, the more he chases after her, the more haughty and disdainful she becomes. And the more she rejects him. And the more she rejects him, the more he sort of wants to chase after her. And so arguably you can see this as a mimetic dynamic. It's not envious in the classical sense, but she is imitating the desire that he has for her, and so she comes to desire herself more, and therefore finds him less and less desirable.
Huh.
And so along comes Rosalind, I think disguised as a man, into the forest, and she encounters this pair of unhappy lovers, and Phoebe, the shepherdess, is sort of giving this poor shepherd a very hard time and behaving very disdainfully towards him. And Rosalind says to her, "Sell, you're not for all markets," which is just devastating. And immediately Phoebe falls in love with Rosalind disguised as a man, because like, so there's this, all of these like protean sort of patterns of desire that fall under the heading of mimetic desire, but that aren't quite envious in the sense that we usually understand that word.
Wow. Interesting. So in the documentary, there's this point where it describes Girard's shift to anthropology and this theory of vengeance and scapegoating. So can you explain that in broad terms?
Yes, I think so. And again, I think it's important to remember that in my understanding of Girard, at least, the human being for him is a social creature before being a violent creature.
Okay. That was one of my questions, is because it seemed like you could come away with the impression that scapegoating is like, or vengeance or violence is just so fundamental to society. That's like almost the reason that we come together in the first place.
Yes. And I think, I have a sort of like 5 or 6 maybe critiques of Girard that I tend to make. And one of them is that there is the risk of an ontology of violence. And I think there are some theologians who have addressed this, and it's sort of more or less convincing. Mm-hmm. But there's no disputing that he is positing that there is a violent foundation for human order.
Right.
And that runs afoul of our basic theological premises as Christians. And so there's some work that needs to be done there to make these two things compatible.
Right. And I see that idea, just as a side note, I see that idea in certain figures today who are influenced by Girard, like who seem to have maybe a kind of a dark, somewhat dark vision of humanity, or maybe a dark vision of Christianity. Like I don't know if you're familiar with Daryl Cooper of the Martyr Maid podcast, who, there was some controversy a while back when he was on Tucker Carlson and all that. But I've really appreciated his podcast, but there does seem to be like a fixation on kind of like the darker side of humanity, and his interpretation of the Old Testament and Job is like, very dark, for instance. And he recently said that Gerard is one of the most influential thinkers for him. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if that pans out in the same way with Peter Thiel or anybody else, because I'm not that familiar with that world. But I can see with some people kind of like this obsession with kind of like the darker, more violent urges that we have, as though like the deeper that we can penetrate into, the deeper we can penetrate into like, Jonestown or Soviet crimes against humanity or something, like the more we can like truly understand the world, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether our understanding of Girardian theory isn't somehow downstream of some like very core theological premises. And if your theology is molded by Calvinism, then when you come to Girard, you're going to be looking for the aspects of his theory that are congruent with your theological priors. And so you could say that, there is a sort of version of Girard where it's very dark, it's very much total depravity, it's very much like mimetic desire just always leads to violence, and so fundamentally human beings are violent, and the fallenness is just sort of very, very accented and emphasized. But I mean, maybe if you want, I can sort of run quickly through sort of the theory of
Go for it.
of scapegoating, which I think is really quite radically a theory of harmonization. And so the idea is that somehow the ability to imitate, we could see it as somehow sort of like helpful, in the sense that you could learn quickly how to do things, and maybe quickly pick up on the most effective ways of surviving, and so there's almost a Darwinian cast to this, which again is sort of can be a stumbling block for somebody who's steeped in Catholic ways of thinking about these questions. But the idea is that you have pre-hominids who are living in the way that animals do, which is that their social order is a pecking order in which there's an alpha, and the mating rituals and rivalries that sort of happen periodically always end with one animal being submissive to the other. So the fights don't escalate beyond a certain threshold. That's kind of, there's an instinctual braking mechanism, in other words, for these rivalries, which probably, for Girard would be mimetic in some sense, and we could get into the degree to which that would be true, but animals do exhibit imitation,
Right.
to some degree. But at a certain point, if you think of imitation as something that in pre-hominids might be, well, to use the Darwinian term, adaptive, you can imagine how it might it might reach the point where the advantage that it confers in terms of your ability to sort of survive also poses a deeper existential risk, in that if this sociability that emerges is mimetic, that can lead to conflict and violence. So the idea, I don't think we've actually done this, so maybe it's worth doing it. Like Girard's idea is like, you imitate other people, and perhaps especially other people that you admire, and you don't just imitate them in the way that I think probably Plato and Aristotle emphasize, which is that like you imitate stuff that you can see about them, like stuff that can be represented, their voice, their language, their way of dressing. but your imitation actually bears on this core part of their being, which is their desire. And so you end up, as soon as you are imitating someone else, you actually are, there's a kind of contagion of goals. You end up having the same goal that this other person does.
Hmm.
And so this can be okay depending on what the goal is,
Right.
right? Like if the goal is like to learn more about Thomas Aquinas, that's great. A teacher can help the people do that. And the teacher can want the people to imitate, and the people wants to imitate.
Hmm.
And there's plenty of this to go around. I mean, all the spiritual goods sort of actually become more abundant
Right.
the more they are shared.
Right.
And so that's very good.
Right.
But if it is something of which there's only one, example or one unit, or something that can't be shared, then it can become very problematic. And the idea is that, like, well, the anthropologists will tell you that there are really three things that primitive societies have to fear that the men in the community will fight over, and that's land, food, and women. So this is a sort of probably pretty significant from a Girardian angle. So you've got the idea is that you've got these like highly sort of social and mimetic pre-hominids whose capacity for imitation and for mimetic desire is now going to lead to mimetic conflict that can no longer be checked by these instinctual breaking mechanisms. And so the animal dominance hierarchies break down. And now you have, instead of one animal being submissive to the alpha, you have the possibility of conflict and vengeance. And so for Girard, this is like the number one existential problem facing humanity. We are more dangerous to ourselves. Our internecine conflicts, our rivalries, pose a greater existential threat to our communities than anything else, natural disasters, predators included. This is the number one problem of human communities. How do we deal with mimetic conflict? And so how do we deal with that?
Yeah.
How do we survive our origins in this one?
He says that animals will typically not fight to the death in a conflict
Right.
if the other animal submits, whereas a human
Right.
being will just completely crush an opponent.
Yes, and I think maybe there have been some recent studies that suggest that some of the higher apes actually do commit murder,
Uh-huh.
but I'm not sure that totally invalidates his outlook on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is that death is a possibility in these fights, and so if if you have a community in which the strongest members of the community are just constantly involved in fighting one another and trying to murder one another, the community is going to implode.
Right.
And so this is an existential problem.
Right.
And so what Girard says is that the way that this resolves itself, it's not political in the sense that people get together at first and decide to do this. It's something that sort of desire almost organizes. Desire is like the subject of this whole process, which is why he calls it a mechanism, the scapegoat mechanism. And this is very disturbing to me in a way. There's the idea that sort of the origins of society are purely mechanistic. But when you're in a conflict with somebody, you see the other person as responsible, as this like, the bad guy who is trying to take your thing, right? I mean, so the imitation involved in the conflict, according to Girard, is unconscious. You look to the other guy and then you want what he wants, but when you start going for it, you're unaware that has happened. And so you're grabbing the thing that he wants, but you feel like, no, he's the interloper. Like you're the bad guy. And so in these conflicts, there's a kind of projection of evil and responsibility onto the other. And this projection is transferable. There's a transference that can happen so that, at least in principle, everybody in the group, they can't share the same woman, they can't share the same land, there may not be enough food to go around, but they can all share the same adversary. Mm-hmm. And they can all project their sense of who is responsible, who is to blame for everything that's going wrong onto the same individual. And if the projection, the hypothesis is that in a sort of, I guess, in a state of nature, if you like, the projection would be sufficiently powerful that this single individual would appear in the eyes of the group that was doing the projecting and the accusation and eventually ganging up on this individual and expelling or dismembering or killing him. This individual would appear monstrous, truly terrifying, the origin of all the evil that has befallen the group. But then, in consenting, if you like, to being expelled, because consent would be necessary. This individual is so powerful that he would have to consent to his own expulsion. He also becomes the savior of the group, because in a de facto way, if the adversary of every member of the group is eliminated from the group, there is no more adversary. There is no more hostility. And so all of the violence of the group through this scapegoating mechanism where the war of all against all is transformed into the war of all against one, the violence is expelled in the person of this scapegoated individual. And this individual becomes transcendent for the group, in the eyes of the group. And so violence is stored, if you like, in this transcendence that thereafter is going to govern the group's behavior and create the group, really, in a truly cultural sense. And thereafter, the idea is that this cathartic event will have very positive effects, but those effects are finite. And sooner or later, somebody is going to eye somebody else's stuff and want it again, and mimetic conflict will break out. But this time, the group will remember what happened before. And over time, as the process plays out, perhaps again and again, the group may implode. But if they are able to hit on this solution a second, a third, a fourth, or fifth time, gradually it becomes institutionalized as a ritual sacrifice. And so human society is fundamentally sacrificial.
So my issue that I want to raise with that right away is that sacrifice, it seems to define sacrifice entirely in terms of vengeance, but sacrifice is also an offering. There is a positive element of offering to God, So it seems like, from a Catholic perspective, or the perspective of what we call natural religion, you start with God and a relationship between man and God, and a relationship of gratitude between man and God. And that sacrifice kind of emerges from that as a tribute or gratitude or something to God. Now, it also, certain kinds of sacrifice also do have this violent aspect, which is worth maybe distinguishing out and thinking about why that would be. But it seems like he's starting with sort of purely human social conflicts, as opposed to this like transcendent, direction of sacrifice where it comes out of this relation between man and God. And that in sacrifice, according to Girard, it sounds like sacrifice is just this mechanism by which you kind of come up with this like ad hoc solution to human social conflict. Well, we need to settle these social problems, and we've come across this solution. As you say, it gets institutionalized over time, and then it sounds like what happens is, in this account, is that any kind of really what we would call a religious aspect to it is kind of like a story that papers over the fundamental reality of what's happening in the sacrifice, which is to solve this social problem by violence.
Yes. I mean, so to just kind of try to attempt to hit a couple of points. First, I'm not sure that the sort of Catholic view is incompatible with the Girardian one. There's one very tricky point that I think remains to be worked out by Girardians, and that is, at what point do we become human in this Girardian scenario? Because it's not clear that the originary conflict is a conflict among humans. Perhaps we can speak of humans per se only after sort of the first scapegoat expulsion has taken place, and the the victim has been in some sense divinized.
But that
And
requires me to buy into a whole evolutionary account and kind of an account of the development of mankind, and uh, also the idea that murder precedes the fall, essentially.
but is it? But again, again, I think there have been a number of attempts to deal with this question. I'm not entirely persuaded by any of them,
Hmm.
and I think you have put your finger on sort of a pain point for the
Hmm.
Girardian theory,
Right.
if you want. But I do think that maybe it's too easy or too facile, but one way of getting around this is just to suggest that no, there was no murder really, because these aren't humans yet. We wouldn't say that a lion that kills a gazelle is murdering the gazelle. And by the
Right.
same token, even if it seems like a bit of a stretch, you could say that the pre-hominids who sort of kill this original victim, or even higher apes who might, and there is some behavior like this attested by ethologists who kill a member of their group. They're not really committing murder yet.
But they're not doing
It's
ritual either.
They're not doing ritual either. It's only after, you could say, like at T+1, so when you have this the emergence of the first transcendence, that the conditions of possibility for humanity are opened up.
Hmm.
And then who knows, maybe there is a way to make the story of the fall, which you and I both adhere to, fit
Yeah.
in with this Gerardian
Because
scenario.
Adam and Eve wouldn't be passing down this tradition from their pre-human ancestors. I mean, they were just in a completely different state in the garden that wouldn't have required any of that. And also, I will say I struggle, not that we can figure that out in this conversation, but I do struggle with the idea of any kind of violence prior to the fall, even between animals.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I do too. I mean, again, and I should say that I'm a literary person, and I like to write fiction, and I like to read novels and think about them, and so I don't. I feel like I'm a little bit less at ease in thinking through some of these deep
mhm,
problems,
mhm.
but I still think they're fascinating, worth thinking through. I also hope we're going to get to sort of the role that the Bible and Christianity plays in all of this for Girard. But before we do, uh, maybe what could you say? I guess I would say, like, yes, two things. First of all, there's this issue of original sin, like how is it transmitted, and it's sort of like uh, imitation is not an option, right? That's a heresy to say
That's
that it's
right.
transmitted by
That's right.
imitation. It's transmitted by generation, and I think that's something that maybe that's a plot hole, sort of in the Girardian theory. Maybe
Mm.
you need to think that through. Then I would say that the story of the fall is extremely Girardian. I mean, if you think about what the serpent does,
Yes.
first is like, well, did you know? Well, I mean, maybe you can help me walk me through the story, but I think the idea is that
Did
somehow
God
he's
really tell you to,
yeah,
not do this? And then, well, God is trying to
it's
keep
like,
you from being like
yes,
him.
God is right. Yeah,
And
exactly.
then Adam imitates
He's your
Eve.
rival.
And yeah,
He's your rival.
yeah.
And so it's like, did he say you couldn't eat you couldn't eat anything? You couldn't
Right,
eat any
right.
fruit.
Yeah.
Well, you just this one tree. Oh, well, but if you eat that fruit, that fruit is going to make you basically like a modern autonomous individual, right? Sort
Yeah,
of
right,
godlike. And
right.
then that transfigures the fruit. The Eve suddenly sees, wow, that fruit looks really good to eat.
Mm,
I
right.
want that. And so it's very much, if you look at the serpent as sort of the bad mimetic model who
Yes.
is suggesting this desire to Eve, it's very much a triangular scenario.
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
then I think Girard was very interested in the story of Cain and Abel as sort of the foundational story of scapegoating and
Hmm.
sacrifice, in the sense that you have these enemy twins who represent a kind of pre-cultural sort of degree zero of human relations, and
Right.
that they're kind of like envious enemy doubles. And he
Hmm.
sees this kind of scenario play out in
Right.
mythology too, with like Romulus and Remus.
But they're
And
sacrificing to God before the enmity arises. The enmity arises of envy of one sacrifice being better than the other, being more
yeah,
acceptable to
I
God.
mean, again, I don't want to say that, like, if you just like take the Girardian skeleton key and like stick it in the keyhole of every biblical story, that immediately this perfect interpretation comes out all tied up with a bow. But there are some suggestive
Right.
sort of resonances there, and maybe even more than that, in the sense that like there really is the idea of a murder as the foundation of cultural difference, because there's going to be the mark of Cain, right? And then this sort of prohibition where like, okay, no, if anybody kills Cain, he's going to get killed seven. There would be
Right.
seven killings will be done, and so you have the beginning of cultural rules there, and it's all rooted in a murder.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, what I do find plausible about the scapegoating thing is that it exists. Not necessarily that it's fundamental to sacrifice, but that sacrifice often serves this function. Certainly in a perverted context, but also in the sense of not that men need to find someone to gang up on, but that sin requires justice, and we need to sacrifice something in order to make atonement to God, and sort of the scapegoat becomes the representative of this, right? Of this sort of exclusion of sin, and the other part that makes sense to me is insofar as this sort of either pathological, because unjust, or in the case of what the Hebrews would do, according to the law with scapegoating, if I remember correctly anyway, imperfect, insufficient reparation, right? And insufficient justice, that it prefigures something later. All that I can get on board with. It's more the kind of like the origins aspect, and like how sacrifice is fundamentally defined and things like that I'm less comfortable with. But maybe you should talk about then how this develops in the Jewish and the Christian context for Gerard.
Yes, and maybe just before doing that, just to go back to the documentary very briefly. I mean, as you saw, there is one of Gerard's collaborators, this Catholic literature professor, passed away recently. He was Gerard's grad student at Buffalo at the time. He was coming up with this original scenario. And yeah, he was quite disturbed and sort of skeptical of this from the outset. And there's some moments in the film where he says, well, Rene, how could you talk about this stuff? You're a devout Catholic. You have this profound religious conversion. I mean, you shouldn't say this kind of stuff out loud. People are going to think you're a nutcase. And so there is a sense in which, there was something very audacious about all of this, and maybe risky, maybe more than audacious. But anyway, yeah, to go on to sort of the third stage in the Girardian rocket, if you will. This is the thesis about the Bible, and in particular the New Testament and Christianity, and its relationship to primitive religion, paganism, and mythology. And I think it's helpful to lay out the context in which Girard was making his arguments. The sort of dominant understanding of Christianity from a sociological or anthropological perspective would have been, and had been for some time at the moment that Girard came along, that really these were all examples of the myth of the dying and rising God, and that they were structurally identical in the sense that the death of Dionysus, the death of Christ, they sort of have all of these common features. And from a positivist perspective, where you're just looking at the data points, it's very difficult to say exactly how they're different. Now, of course, I say this, it's difficult to say if you're coming at this as a positivist and just looking at the data and maybe already have a very strong bias against Christianity, which would have been the case for many of the people who were making these arguments. But anyway, what Girard is doing is he's going to say, yeah, I sort of agree with this. And there is something kind of disturbing about this. I have my theory of scapegoating and sacrifice. And then when I look at the New Testament and at the passion of Christ, what I'm seeing is basically the same drama playing itself out. let's look at the myth of Oedipus, which would be for Girard, well, not only a powerful cultural reference because of the dominance of Freudianism at the time, but also, I think, for many of us, a sort of go-to myth, one that remains, has some cultural potency even
Yeah.
today. You look at the myth of Oedipus. What do you have? You have this social crisis, and then you have the search for a culprit because the social crisis must be due to the god's anger.
Right.
And the idea is that if you can identify the person who's responsible for all of this and somehow bring him to justice, then
Right.
the gods will be appeased and the crisis will dissipate.
Right.
Well, similarly, in the Gospels, you have this social crisis, and you can describe it in various ways. But for the Jewish people, it's it's an existential moment for them. They're sort of looking to be freed from the Roman Empire in the same way, perhaps, that the Israelites were freed from the Egyptians, because their society is being crushed. And you have you have these people in power who are looking for some kind of a scapegoat. We have the high priest who says, well, to save the nation, it would be better for one man to die. You have Pilate and Herod, who sort of after the crucifixion sort of make nice, and the sense that had there never been a resurrection and sort of the authorship of the Gospels, this whole scenario would just look very much like a myth where the culprit is discovered and he's taken outside of the city in the same way that Oedipus is. Now, Oedipus puts out his own eyes. In this case, the punishment is inflicted by others. But it's basically the whole community getting together and doing this act, which from the mythological perspective is a just act. It's sort of solving the problem in the way that the gods want you to.
Mm-hmm.
And so Girard says, yes, I agree with this. There's a structural similarity here. But there's also this huge sort of abyssal difference, which is it's so obvious that it's kind of hard to see, like the purloined letter or something. And that's simply that mythology and primitive religion in general represents all of this from the point of view of a panicked crowd that is feels like it's doing its civic duty in expelling this guilty individual, whereas the Gospels represent it from the point of view of a convicted, repentant sinner who understands that he has been complicit in an act of terrible injustice.
So meaning that the disciples of Christ or
The disciples
Christian
of Christ.
people in general.
And even Gerard is going to point to any number of sort of lines in the Gospels to make this case. One of them could just be the good thief who says, we're guilty of crimes. We actually did something, but this man is innocent. Right. He didn't do anything wrong. So why is he up there on the cross? And of course, it's again, it's very difficult. It feels so wrong in a way to be talking about these. This is God, right? Who's right there. We've killed God, and there's a risk of a kind of irreverence in just discussing this as if it's like just one more iteration of some immemorial drama.
But the point is that it flips it on its head, right?
It flips it on its head. It flips it on its head.
And now he is the one. Now sacrifice is abolished, other than his eternal sacrifice.
Exactly. This brings me to another pain point, though, and I think it's really important what you just said, and I wish that we could make this sort of centerpiece of the Girardian narrative. Girard was very anti-sacrificial in his formulations, particularly in his early books. And he sort of saw Christianity as this deconstruction, or even destruction of pagan religion.
Right.
But he didn't really make room for a new kind of sacrifice, which would be the self-sacrifice of Christ. And then in dialogue with this Austrian Jesuit who became the dean of the Faculty of Theology in Innsbruck after Karl Rahner, Reimann Schwager, he sort of came around and understood, well, the Council of Trent says that the Mass is a sacrifice and on pain of anathema. So I better rethink some of this. And he wrote a little essay called Mimetic Theory and Theology, I believe, in which he says, no, my friend, the Jesuit Schwager, is right. And I was wrong to say that Christianity is just purely anti-sacrificial. It is sacrificial, but in a new way.
Right, which requires a recognition of the kind of the good of sacrifice in natural religion. Um,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, and indeed, and in fact, Gerard will say also like I sort of I didn't recognize sort of the holiness of the whole religious history of humanity sufficiently in my
Mm,
early works.
yes. I mean Melchizedek, right? So,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
uh,
yeah, very interesting. Well, oh yes, I just wanted to say about Oedipus though, because I love those plays about Oedipus. Oedipus does seem unique also because it really is from the point of view of the scapegoat as well. But
yes,
the tragedy is that he is so, as I see it, what makes that Oedipus Rex so powerful is that he is so relentlessly seeking the truth without regard to his own self-preservation at all. He seeks the truth so relentlessly that it ends up in his own kind of destruction. But then in the later, in Oedipus at Colonus, which I think is a very powerful work, he almost becomes this like holy figure afterwards. It's like enlightened holy figure, which is that's one of the only pagan writings from Greece that has ever given me a sense of the holy in
mm,
terms of stories about the gods and things like that. Most of them don't really give me a sense of the transcendent or the holy, but that story, and I think, is it Apollo? There's this sort of apotheosis of Apollo at the end. I can't remember, of Oedipus at Colonus, but
I can't remember either.
he has this. There's this kind of like divine culmination of the work, and it's very powerful and kind of numinous. Anyway, that's a tangent, but I just think it is
Well,
interesting that there's something like that in Oedipus where they are dealing with the kind of like the terribleness of this way of solving problems.
yeah. So I mean, I actually think that it's worth discussing Oedipus maybe briefly because Oedipus was very important for Girard. I think that he probably understood like, well, Freud has this immense cultural currency in the 1960s when he's starting to think through these problems, and so he wants to tackle Oedipus and show that he can provide a new reading of the
Hmm.
Oedipus myth.
Yeah.
But there's a series of 3 articles he wrote in the 60s that really are the bridge between his literary criticism and his anthropological theory. And they're all about Oedipus. And he begins with something very close to what you just said about Oedipus relentlessly seeking the truth to the point of bringing about his own destruction. In other words, Oedipus becomes for him the model of the literary creator or the novelist who first accuses others of, you know, of all the bad stuff. There's this back and forth between Oedipus and Tiresias, where
Oh,
Oedipus
right. Yeah.
accuses Tiresias of saying, like, if you weren't, if you weren't an old blind man, I would say, maybe you killed Laius yourself.
Hmm.
And then Tiresias is sort of accusing him, and there's all this back and forth. And the idea is that like Oedipus is sort of converted in a sense, in the sense that he recognizes his own guilt. And for Girard, this is very much what the great novelist does. Marcel Proust writes a first draft of his novel in which his main character is just this really intelligent, sensitive young man who loves to talk to duchesses, not because they're duchesses and he's a snob, but because they have such good taste and they have the same interests in Ruskin that he does, and so they can have all of these wonderful conversations heart to heart. But all of the people around him just want to get close to the duchesses because they're duchesses and because these
Hmm.
people are abject snobs. And so this is his first attempt at writing a novel, and then his later work in Search of Lost Time just completely does away with this framework. It's like suddenly the main character has the same snobbish desires as the characters who were depicted as snobs in the first work, but the reader gets the subjectivity of that desire. Like it gets access to what it's like to be a snob and so that's for Girard, that's Proust sort of living through this Oedipus drama where you accuse everybody else of all the bad stuff, and you sort of set out to find the culprit, and then in the end, you realize it was you
Right.
all
Right.
along.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. So, I just want to touch on a couple of other interesting points from the documentary. Do you remember that there was something about Peter's denial? There was some discussion of Peter's.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that for a minute? I just remember that being compelling.
Yes. That that was so the backbone of the documentary, this long interview with Gerard from 2005, conducted by Stephen Barry, who's an associate producer on the film, and it's a wonderful interview. It's sort of Gerard at the height of his sort of late career wisdom, um, and yet he retains a certain vivacity, and so uh, Barry sort of asks him about like, well, some people object to Christianity on the grounds that there aren't really any good stories, you know, and so Gerard fires right back. He says, no, one of the most beautiful stories uh, is the story of the denial of Peter denying Christ. And you can actually find the whole clip on YouTube. And I would have loved to include the whole clip, but it's like 19 minutes long or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had to find a way of sort of condensing it and just getting to the essence of it. But I think it's Gerard at his absolute best. I think it's a highly autobiographical clip. I think it goes back to a book that was very influential on him, which is Eric Auerbach's Mimesis, which locates the source of Western realism in the Gospel of Mark, and particularly in the story of Peter's denial. And so it has all these dimensions to it. It's just Gerard showing himself to be a bravura interpreter and a wonderful master of rhetoric and persuasion, because in this clip he uses hand gestures, facial expressions, and tone of voice in a way that I think is just marvelous.
But what does he
And
say in the? Can you just remind me? I'm not
yeah,
remembering the
so
details. Yeah.
yeah, so no, but all of that. So I know this is sort of window dressing, but what he's really saying is that um, the story of Peter's denial is sort of the story of all of us. It's the recognition on the part of Peter, and maybe we find this the most in the Gospel of Mark, because in some sense maybe Mark was just like Peter's ghostwriter, and there are all these eyewitness details in the Gospel. We find this in the Gospel of Mark. It's sort of where Peter's represented. He looks really bad in the Gospel of Mark, right? So it's like
Right.
Peter must have had a hand in writing this. It's the story of a man who sort of was still in the mode of like antique self-mastery, where like, you know, I can resist the crowd. I'm going to follow you, master, no matter what happens. I will be there. I will defend you. And he almost does. I mean, he follows him. After Jesus is arrested and taken off to the high priest's place for you know, sort of a show trial. Peter follows him, and he goes all the way into the courtyard. But then Gerard is going to say, like, this is where Peter's story just kind of gets at this essential weakness of man, and the Gospels sort of show you that antique self-mastery, it's wonderful, like virtue, it's good, we should all be pursuing it, but there's a moment at which it's going to break down, and we're going to discover our nothingness. And this is what Peter lives through. And he just he's for Gerard, it's almost as much snobbery as it is a fear for his life. It's like the servant girl is going to say, you know, hey, I've seen you before, and also, you know, you have a Galilean accent. You sound like a hick. You know, you don't belong in this city. You sound different. And Peter just doesn't want to feel different. He doesn't want to be associated with Jesus, and so he denies. And for Gerard, this is just what we all do. And Peter is sort of like the representative of not just the apostles, but of humanity. He shows us sort of the limits of human self-determination and human strength and our need for salvation. And so we put it at the end of the film because we thought it was the high point. And we thought that this was Gerard at his very best, speaking indirectly about himself, but also just in a beautiful way, you know, explicating this wonderful Christian story.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, the other thing I wrote down was either we love each other like Christians or we kill each other, and that speaks to kind of, it does seem like one thing Gerard is doing with both of his big ideas is kind of critiquing certain treasured modern ideas. One of which would be kind of this idea of authenticity and like being like self-originating with mimesis, and then the other one would, I mean, there's a lot to it, but one that this line would sort of critique would be, I mean, any prospect of peace without this solution that is offered by the sacrifice of Christ. That
Yes.
this is an intractable human problem, basically.
Yes. I mean, what Gerard is going to say is that the sacrifice of Christ breaks the scapegoat mechanism.
Right.
It cracks it open, and
Right.
it doesn't destroy it doesn't erase scapegoating. We scapegoat all the time,
Right.
but it destroys scapegoating's power to generate new law, to create new differences, to produce new cultural forms, and and it sort of breaks up all of these little isolated communities founded on scapegoating, and it initiates gradually a process of globalization in which the world societies will be somehow united to the extent that we get to the one world state later, but I mean, but I don't think he wants that, but to the extent that all of these sort of local barriers are broken down, and we sort of live in this global village, and because of technological progress, we have these weapons, nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapon was for Girard this very big existential thing that personally terrified him, and that he grappled with, I think, for much of his adult life, and that he saw as, sort of, I mean, his whole theory is talking about it in a way, because it's like we're back in the situation of these primitive communities who have to deal with their own violence and face up to their inability to master their own violence. We have the nuclear bomb. Humanity has the capacity for self-destruction. It's sort of a question of how we're going to react. Are we, yeah, as you said, that is the alternative that you pose. Are we going to love each other in a Christian way? Or maybe somebody's going to push the button and we're going to end up destroying ourselves.
Right.
So for him, the apocalypse is not like God's wrath being visited upon the world, but human beings refusing to embrace the rules of the kingdom of God.
Is there anything else you want to say about the documentary or the process of making it?
Yeah, I mean, I very briefly would say that Sam Sorich, he's told the story of how he came to Gerard elsewhere, and I don't want to tell it for him, but he began working on this documentary after Gerard's death in 2015, and he got in a van and he drove around the country for a couple of months at least, maybe even longer, interviewing people who knew Gerard or who were close to him. And actually, I was one of the people whom he interviewed at the time. And when finally, several years later in 2021, I was finally attached to this project and tasked with helping Sam to make the film, I was actually really happy about that, because I knew that that would give me the power to make sure that my own footage would never make its way into the film. And so, yeah, it was about 4 years ago that I started working on the film with Sam. And at first, the idea was that I was going to be the writer, and I was, I'd written a novel, I'd worked on a couple of small film projects. How hard could it be to write the voiceover narration for this documentary? It soon became quite apparent that that was not the right path, and there is no voiceover narration in the documentary. We didn't need any, and
The
so
voiceover
really,
is quotes from Gerard read by his son, right?
yeah, you're right. There is a little bit of voiceover narration, but that's right. It's all first-person quotes from Gerard, either reminiscences that he authored or letters that he had written, and they're read by his son Martin, who was, a big help in the course of making the film. And so, yeah, so Sam and I just worked together on this film. I wasn't the writer. I was sort of like, I could say like, he would come out to my office at Caltech, and we sort of turned this office where I am right now into a little production studio. He would have his computer. We'd open up the the editing software and go into the timeline and just say, okay, well, where do we start? What if we put this clip here? If it doesn't work there, what if we put it there? Okay, let's try different ordering. then when he was in Chicago, because that's where he was based at the time, he's now in San Diego teaching at JP2 Catholic, teaching film there. We'd get on the Zoom call, and basically it was like he would come up with something, I would shoot it down brutally. He would go back, and instead of listening to my suggestions, he would come up with something that was neither like the original thing he had done or like the thing that I had suggested, but that actually worked. And little by little, by doing that, we put the film together.
Cool. Why do you think Gerard is so big right now?
That's a really good question. I mean, in some sense, you could say that Gerard is a 20th century thinker. I mean, his idea of sort of mimetic competition and mimetic doubles, you could see how that would have resonated and almost come out of a Cold War scenario where you had these two superpowers competing for world dominance. But he's really only become better known, I think, at least in the United States in the 21st century, though he did have his brief moment of fame in the late 70s in France. And I have a couple of ideas about this. I think the fact that people like Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, cite him, has played a big role in this. I mean, there's a mimetic dynamic that goes on, right? Like Peter Thiel is this very successful, famous person, and if you're a young guy in Silicon Valley, you want to be like him, and so you want to figure out sort of what's his secret, and maybe if you read the same books he does, you can become as successful an investor as he was. And
right.
So
I mean, it's worth mentioning. Sorry that this is catching on among non-Catholics. Peter Thiel is a self-described Christian, but
yes,
not Catholic.
Yes, but yeah, and so that's one account of this, is sort of, and I think that has had a big impact. I think, but maybe on a societal scale, the rise of social media, I think, has made a lot of these ideas seem very relatable and very concrete.
Yeah.
Sort of like, why do tweets go viral?
Why do people get canceled?
Yeah, why did Justine Sacco, end up, publicly shamed for this stupid joke that she told on Twitter? She just had a few followers. She got on the plane. She hit send tweet. She gets off the plane a few hours later, and her whole life has been destroyed. She's lost her job. She's like a sort of. This kind of thing, and I think if you want to read something about this, I would go to Jeff Schellenberger's articles in Tablet and then in Compact. I think he's really put his finger on this. And in particular, there's an article that he wrote from 2022 called René Girard and the Rise of Victim Power, I think, which is about, it sort of focuses on George Floyd in the summer of 2020. And the question is like, okay, we live in this ostensibly secular global culture. How come we have these like sort of obviously sort of religious rituals unfolding before our eyes? And so he turns to Girard to make sense of that. And I think he wasn't the only one. And then I would say also, in addition sort of to the rise of social media and cancel culture, and the summer of 2020 and sort of maybe political violence, you also just have the work of people like Cynthia Haven, who wrote the biography on Girard. Luke Burgess did this book called Wanting, which is a very lucid explanation of Girard's ideas.
These are Catholic scholars, right?
These are Catholic scholars. Burgess's book is a trade book that had a big audience. He did a ton of podcasts. He put on this conference at CUA where you had like Ross Douthat and other luminaries were there. And it sort of pushed Girard more into the mainstream, or at least into the mainstream media mainstream. And then in France, you have this recent biography by my friend Benoit Chantre, who's Girard's interlocutor on his last book, Battling to the End. He wrote this massive biography. It's like more than 1,000 pages long. It was finalist for all the biggest French literary awards. It was reviewed everywhere. Roland Barthes' biographer wrote a positive review of the Girard biography in Le Monde. And so suddenly Girard has been resituated as this sort of member of the sort of post-war intellectual cohort of French theorists alongside Foucault, Derrida, Barthes. And
even though he didn't fit in at the time.
Yeah, I think he was sort of like, there's a book called French Theory by François Cousset. It talks about sort of how French theory caught on in the U.S., but Girard isn't mentioned, which I think
Right.
is it's an injustice, but it's not that. It just sort of misrepresents how things actually were.
Hmm.
Girard was close with Derrida, and he had a correspondence with Foucault, and so on.
Okay.
And so I think the sort of French intellectuals are starting to recognize that that's the case. And then in theology, you've got this whole, you've got some people working on Girard.
Bishop Barron has, put his name around.
So that's another name I wanted to mention, because actually I think Bishop Barron is a very sophisticated and sort of good interpreter of Girard, and he's done some wonderful videos. There's one he did on the Hunger Games and Girard that was very good. And he studied in Paris, I believe. I may be getting this wrong, but I'm pretty sure he studied in Paris under Michel Corbin, who is the great French expert on Anselm. And if you go to, this is my friend Grant Kaplan pointed this out to me and to others, if you go to Corbin's masterpiece on Anselm, it is dedicated to René Girard. And so there must have been a close relationship there. And so maybe that's where Bishop Barron picked up on this Girard thing. Girard was already also close to Cardinal Lustiger. And so, there's, among a certain group of French Catholics, I think his thought had some real currency.
Okay. So personally, after watching the documentary and after this conversation, the book by Girard I'm most interested in reading is Deceit, Desire, and the Novel. But I just wanted to ask you where you thought people should start in reading Girard's works.
Well, I can only echo that recommendation. It's my favorite of his books. If you like Shakespeare, I think his book on Shakespeare, Theater of Envy, is a very complete statement of his ideas through the lens of Shakespeare's comedies, tragedies, and romances. And it's a sort of a thrilling book. It's a bit monomaniacal in a way because it brings the same interpretive grid to several plays in a row. But it also shows the evolution of Shakespeare's creative development. It's a fascinating book. So I like those two books. Of course, if you're more interested in religion and theology, you might want to start with I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, which is the most complete statement and the most compact one, perhaps the most accessible one of Girard's whole religious and anthropological theory.
And you are working on a sequel to your first novel, right?
That is right. I'm currently working on it, and it's, I'm almost afraid to talk about it for fear that if I talk about it too much, I won't finish it.
Sure, fair enough.
But yes, I'm working on a sequel to Minor Dignities, which was a campus novel about a naive kid from rural New England who finds himself on this sophisticated college campus adjacent to New York City, and sort of has an interesting quasi-conversion path. And this novel is going to pick up the story a few years later as he's embarking on adulthood for the first time, and he will end up going to France. And so a good deal of the novel will take place in France, which I hope will be an opportunity to have some fun.
Great. Looking forward to that. Well, Trevor, thank you so much for coming on. This was a very interesting interview.
Well, thanks very much, Thomas. It's always a pleasure to do this with you.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.